I am Pete Rogers, and I am a partner and the Deputy General Counsel at KPMG International. I'm based in London. Welcome everyone, wherever you are in the world today, on today's session on burnout. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by three experts on the subject from Mckinsey. So we've been joined by Brad Herbeig, Leah Arora, and Alistair Carmichael. And I believe a brief summary of their experience is going to be posted in the chat, but they'll also say a little bit about themselves when they answer their first question on the panel today. So I just wanted to open up firstly just by saying a few words about burnout to give some context. So as we all know, the intensity of work and life in general seems to intensify year on year. And that was exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's led to reports of rapidly rising rates of burnout. So the purpose really of today's session is to explore burnout. So we're going to address some themes, like what is it? What causes it? We're going to explore intergenerational and cultural differences. We're going to look at the implications for businesses, and also, really importantly, to talk about what employers can do about it. And the way we're going to do that is to explore that through the lens of some recent, really outstanding work that Mckinsey has done in this area. So in terms of burnout, this is a key issue for us in business. So I wanted to just give you one example from the legal sector, and that's the sector that I'm from. So I recently attended a CMHA UK roundtable, which involved many of the world's biggest law firms. And a lot of that discussion, it wasn't specifically about burnout, but a lot of the discussion focused on burnout. In the UK, a body called Law Care has done some research which suggests that legal professionals are at high risk of burnout. You may have seen similar statistics in your own home markets. And I've no doubt that you can extrapolate that across the various types of high intensity jobs that you and all your colleagues perform. And that risk is particularly acute for people in the age range between 26 to 35, is what Law Care showed. And that age group reported the lowest levels of autonomy, psychological safety, and the highest work intensity. And importantly, and I say this statistic a lot to people, last year there was a really seminal paper by the World Health Organization, which revealed, if we're just focusing on long working hours, that led to significant increased risk of death by heart disease and stroke. So the mental and the physical, as always, go together. And there are just a couple of quotes from that session with the lawyers that I thought would be useful in terms of setting some context for today. So one of them which stuck in my mind was that our ways of working are damaging our health and they're shortening our lives. And another person at that session commented that it's not acceptable to consider mental ill health as inevitable collateral damage due to how we work. At a personal level, I'm sure it's the same with everyone on this call today. I've come across people too numerous to mention over the years who've been affected by burnout. And that's impacted in a multiplicity of ways on their physical health and also on their mental health. And that includes me in my mid-30s. I was hospitalized for depression and anxiety and just burnt out. And just to set some, I guess, some tone for today's conversation, in my experience, we achieve the most in mental health where we combine everyone on this call's tremendous passion to want to improve the world when it comes to well-being. And that usually arises from their own experience and their own stories, whether it's their stories or other people who are close to them. And what we do is combine that with the power of research, like McKinsey's research, along with the collaboration of all the people on this call and others. And I think a real key to the success of the CMHA and also to the Mind Forward Alliance is it provides a gateway for this exchange of passion, of research and collaboration. And what it does, forums like this, is it allows us to tap into that energy and to the experience of all the members and the other people who are attending today's session. And just another point before I hand over for my first question, a key to success in all of this is a recognition that we're all on our learning journeys and we're all experimenting. So dealing with issues like burnout is difficult, and we all work in high intensity, high performing, competitive environments. And finding a path through all of that's really challenging. So I'd encourage us all today on the call and in the future to do that together. And in that spirit, I'd encourage you all as well to feel free to ask questions or express views in the chat as we go along. We'd really welcome that, and very happy to deal with those as we go along. So I'm going to turn now to the questions. And Brad, I was going to start with you. So everyone's talking about burnout and it's become a bit of a buzzword. Could you just start by telling us what burnout is?
Yeah, absolutely. And happy to be here. Just as a quick introduction, I'm Brad Herbeig. I'm based in Philadelphia in the US, and I lead the Mckinsey Health Insitute's research around employee mental health and well-being. And when you think about burnout, I think a couple of things come to mind. One is burnout is an occupational phenomenon, so it's something that draws from the experience at work. And one way of thinking about burnout is it's a chronic imbalance between the demands of your job, such as your workload or having a challenging working environment, and the resources you have to meet those demands, including things like having adequate staffing or supportive work relationships. And when those things are in imbalance chronically, what this can lead to are symptoms such as extreme tiredness, mental distancing, or cynicism about work, which collectively is referred to as burnout. And not only are those things kind of impactful to your mental and physical health in general, but they also have been correlated with other mental health challenges such as anxiety and depression.
Thanks, Brad. I've already seen just a couple of questions coming up in the chat, and they're practical questions. So the first question is, what do you think businesses are getting wrong with their approach to burnout? And conversely, where should organizations start in addressing burnout? And Alistair, I wonder if I can turn to you first. I know you were going in the paper that you talk about taking a systemic approach to addressing employee mental health. And I wonder if we can address those two questions in the context of that.
Yeah, happy to, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. So, Alistair Carmichael, based in Sydney, also one of McKinsey's leaders in the Mckinsey Health Insitute, and come at this with lived experience on the topic, as well as I think many of us do. When we think about this systematic approach, what it's about is making two big shifts from how we often look at workplace mental health. The first of those shifts is being proactive. As much as with the best intent, a lot of how we respond, and including how we respond to burnout, is reactive. It's after the fact, it's after something has happened in the workplace. It's important that we actually move to be proactive, identify things before they happen, and then we can intervene. The second part of it is then being integrated. A lot of our efforts, and we saw this through the pandemic, were at the individual level, and we're saying that we are going to help our people to become more resilient. And that has its place, absolutely has its place, but the need is to become more integrated and take action at the same time at the individual, at the team, and the organizational level. And so practically, that's things like actually just being clear on, is this a strategic objective or not? And so if you're going to say, hey, burnout it's important for us to get on top of this, is this a strategic objective or not? And therefore, are we putting resources behind it? And then the second thing is then looking holistically across your operating model and saying, is it helping or is it harming? So we can talk about the workload and work intensity, but are we actually looking at how we prioritize work? And through moving to being more proactive and taking action across each of those levels, then you've got a chance at actually turning the tide on some of this. and really making some of those shifts. And I would say that I don't know that employers are getting it wrong. I think it's, as you called out in the introduction, people are still learning on this one. But hopefully through working together, through events like this, people can accelerate so we can learn faster together, and we'll all benefit as a result.
Thanks, Alistair. Leah or Brad, I wonder if you've got any additional reflections on what Alistair's just said.
Yeah, sure, I can go ahead. So thank you, Pete. As a quick intro, my name is Arora. I'm a fellow from MHI based in Paris, and I've been looking more into Gen Z mental health and also Gen Z mental health at the workplace. So I can bring some kind of nuances across generations, and especially Generation Z. So what we define as Generation Z are the people aged 18 to 24. And what I would add is that when we look at this generation, they report in general like poor mental health versus other generations. And they do mention the workplace as a factor that are negatively impacting their health. So therefore, reporting more symptoms of burnout, anxiety, and depression, and also putting the emphasis on having resources in the workplace which will help them with their mental health.
Thanks, Leah. So Brad, if I turn to you now, so the research that McKinsey's done shows rising rates of burnout and mental health challenges amongst employees around the globe. Could you tell us a bit more about the types of problems the workplace, or the workforce rather, is facing, and the key drivers behind those?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about burnout, what we found in our research was about 1 in 4 people globally reported that they had been experiencing symptoms of burnout. And so that's a huge number and a huge part of the workforce. And if you expand that definition to include any type of mental health challenge, we actually found it reached 59% globally. So this isn't a small group that is having issues. This is your workforce that is having challenges to their mental health because of how the workplace impacts them. And when we looked at kind of the drivers of people who were experiencing burnout, for example, we found that the things that were most predictive of whether or not someone was experiencing symptoms of burnout were not whether they had access to resources or whether they were more or less resilient. What we found was it was really the day-to-day work environment that had the largest impact on whether or not they were burnt out. So when we look at the top 3 factors, the one that was far and away the most predictive was whether they experienced toxic workplace behavior at work. And so what does that mean? It means the type of behaviors that leave people feeling unvalued, belittled, or unsafe. And it could include things like your manager putting you down, or your coworkers cutting you out of social situations or things like that. So there are things that are really devaluing you as a person. And we found that actually contributed to about 70% of the predictability of whether or not someone was experiencing burnout. So it was a significant driver. And then the next 2 top ones were ones that I think have impact across a number of realms, but especially showed up here in burnout. And that was, did you feel included at work? And is your work sustainable? And so, as we were talking about before, that does involve the amount of work and the amount of resources you have to get there, but it also involves kind of how you do the work and whether you have a sense of autonomy, whether you feel safe, you can contribute, or whether it's something that is happening to you. And so those were a few of the factors that really bubbled up to the top as the strongest drivers of burnout in our research.
Thanks, Brad. Alistair, there's been a question about communication and leadership. And the question has 2 parts. Firstly, how can leadership send the message that they've begun to take these steps? And secondly, how can they communicate to their employees that they care about mental health and they care about their community's well-being?
It's a great question, and leadership and leadership role modeling plays a very important role here. So one of the ways that leaders can I guess there's a few ways that leaders can show that they care, show that this is important. The first of them is actually getting visibly educated on the topics that we're talking about. And visibly educated is actually acknowledging that we are all on this learning journey and being able to actually get smart so they can talk about it. And it's not assuming that they are an expert. And that is also getting smart on their organization. So what is actually happening, what's the experience in their organization? Because the experience of individuals is going to be different depending on where they're at in their life stage and and other sort of pressures that they've got around them. Then once they're clear on what's going on, the next biggest thing comes about actually being able to communicate authentically about their own experience and what their expectations are in the workplace. And it's that expectations part ends up being the biggest kicker, in that all of the best effort and best intention, best communication, best learning can go out the window if the actions that follow don't match the words. And so if you imagine, Brad's mentioned about toxic workplace behavior. In every one of our workplaces, and I've certainly seen this in some of the ones that I've worked at over the years, that there are these really unpleasant, unproductive jerks, if you call them that they can actually do a lot of damage to people's individual experience. Those are some of the people and how the organizations deals with that, if they are the drivers of some of the toxic workplace behavior, particularly if they're profitable for the organization, are the moments that will matter in terms of showing that you're genuinely behind it. So there's part of it is getting smart internally and externally. Part of it is communicating authentically about your journey and what you're going to do. And then importantly is following through and really following through in the moments that matter.
And Lee, if we link what Alistair's just been talking about with your earlier comments in relation to different generations, and particularly younger people, for leadership purposes, what do you think they need to know about in terms of understanding what the next generation are looking for when it comes to choosing an employer?
Yeah. So as I was mentioning, Gen Z is really putting an emphasis on having like solutions and access in the workplace to really like deploy their full potential. So in our survey, over 2/3 of Gen Z students mentioned that mental health resources were very important in selecting a future employer. And this comes in complement to other resources, so be it like related to physical health, so just having gyms, or social health, sort of like meeting and connecting with people. They do put mental health resources as their top priority. So as Gen Z is gonna become a quarter of the global workforce in the coming years, it's becoming more and more critical for organizations to kind of transform, as Alistair and Brad were mentioning, like inherently, but also provide those resources for this younger generation.
We've had a question on KPIs. So the question is, how can leaders get a baseline on burnout in their organization and to understand whether they're making progress as they start to take some of these steps you've outlined? Brad, I'd be interested in your thoughts on that question.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it is critical that you need to measure and listen to your people to understand not only are you helping improve that baseline, but also are you doing the things that will help reach that goal. So I think one example of how to measure and get the baseline on burnout. So the Mckinsey Health Insitute has designed a freely available diagnostic survey around that can be launched to employees that really measures not only kind of symptoms of burnout, but also these workplace factors that we were talking about that we found have a significant impact. So measuring, is the work sustainable? Do people feel included at work? Have they experiencing toxic behaviors? And so that's one way that you can go about measuring kind of not only the outcome of burnout, but also some of the upstream drivers. I would say in general, like pulse surveys are a good way to really get an idea of where in the organization you may have differences in experience, especially if you can compare across levels. So for example, the experience in one part of your organization may be different for a non-manager individual contributor versus a manager versus a director. And it's really important to understand the differences in experience, because it is driven, the day-to-day work is different for different groups, and that can then lead to different outcomes that we've been talking about.
And Brad, if we just stay with you, I mentioned in my opening remarks issues about culture. Oh, actually, sorry, Alistair, I'll address this question to you. Is the situation the same across the globe? And if it isn't, how does it differ based on the country?
Yeah, there are factors that are very common across the globe, and there are things that are different. So if we take burnout, for example, the research showed it was somewhere in the order of 1 in 4. But if you look at certain regions, so Asia, where I'm joining from, it's more like 1 in 3. So higher frequency of burnout. Symptoms of depression, symptoms of anxiety were on par with global results, but 1 in 3. And if you then look at the drivers of what's going on, that's where you do see some country level nuance. So Brad mentioned toxic workplace behavior. Basically everywhere we looked, that was a major factor. 70% overall, but in some countries it was more like 90%. It could explain a huge portion of the variation. But then in some other countries, so if we take Japan and Australia, sustainable work was doubly as important in Japan as it was anywhere else that we looked. That's not a surprise, but it was a factor that was particularly important there. In Australia, inclusion and belonging as a factor was doubly important anywhere else. So there are country level differences that come into play here. There's also differences in how things like burnout manifests based on where you are around the world, how they're shown, what the behavior looks like. And what this means for leaders is that it shows the importance, one, of having the right measurement, so you can actually understand what's going on, but then making sure you're coming at it with curiosity and seeking to understand what's going on in these different locations, and develop however it is that you intervene in ways that are going to resonate for that country, for that culture, for that local expectation and experience. And not having the one size fits all, because the reality nowadays is one size does not fit all. It doesn't even fit most anymore.
And you've all touched on this issue about toxic workplace culture. So to frame it in a more positive way, how can an organization go about encouraging and indeed putting in place a healthy workplace culture? So perhaps, Alistair, if I turn to you first, and then Brad and Leah, if I'd welcome your thoughts as well.
I think it's a great question. And just one thing on the toxic workplace behavior that it's important not to lose is that nothing in the definition speaks to intent. A lot of the behavior that goes on in an organization that would fall within the bounds of what we'd say is toxic is actually not deliberately aimed at harming an individual. Often it does come from a position of just stress behaviors or ignorance or something that's playing out. And so if we do look at this with the positive frame of it, of actually saying, well, what's the flip side of that? Well, the flip side of that is a workplace that is inclusive. It's a flip side of that is a workplace that allows people to bring their whole self to work, to show up. So if we're going to build that in our workplaces, there's a few things that we can do. First is get clear when we say we want to build a certain type of culture. Culture manifests as behavior. Get very clear on the behaviors that you want to see in your workplace. What are the things? And these are the things we want to see: a workplace that values different perspectives. And that's not just good for burnout, that's good for business. Or we want to see whatever the behaviors are, and then putting in place the right sort of infrastructure to encourage that to happen. And that infrastructure is 4 things broadly: that there is a compelling story as to why that behavior is important. The second is that you give people the skills, the capabilities to actually perform that behavior day to day. If you're asking people to be inclusive in their language, you might need to build their capability to do so. Thirdly, is you then reinforce it. And that's both that you're measuring it, but you're also rewarding the behavior that you want to see. And then fourth, and most importantly, we've touched on this before, is just that leaders are role modeling it. And if you're clear on the shift you want to see, the behavior, and you take those 4 steps, you can actually build the inclusive cultures that we're really talking about here. And you can build these cultures, and they're not just good for burnout. We know that they're good for engagement, they're good for retention, and they're actually great for business performance, because it means you're having broader perspectives. It means that you're having more engaged people. So it's a few thoughts. But Brad, Leah, welcome your ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. I think completely agree with all of the things Alistair said. I think building on that last point a bit too about kind of leaders being bought into the vision and living it themselves. I think that's especially crucial when you are looking at kind of behaviors that are tied to the experience that leads to things like burnout. So if I'm thinking about kind of leaders who are talking about supporting mental health and are celebrating Mental Health Awareness Day and doing those things, but then aren't doing the things that when an individual employee looks at their day-to-day work and says, this is what's really driving my feelings of burnout. I think it's crucial to not only do the kind of the communication and the role modeling, which is important, but also to show that you are caring about the day-to-day and the struggles of the individual people, because that then not only makes you a more empathetic leader, but also helps the individuals feel that the things you are doing are with good intent and are meant to help you actually work through this.
And Leah, anything you'd like to add to that, with particular reference to the issues you were talking about earlier in terms of different generations, but more broadly, I'd very much welcome any thoughts you might have as well.
Yes, fully aligned with Brad and Alistair, and I do think that talking about, as Brad was mentioning, vulnerability, compassion, being really compassionate in your team, really resonates with the younger generations, especially as they are very, exposed to technology, social media. They do define themselves related to how people, they really look up for role models. I do believe that being those role models, but showing it and being authentic in it, really would resonate more with younger generations.
And just one build on it is that it's, I think, important for us to keep in mind here is that we can all fall into the trap of thinking that this, for senior leaders, that this is a challenge for our organization out there. The reality is our senior leaders are struggling too, and that they've gone through, particularly through the pandemic, a lot of senior leaders around the world have been holding organizations together. So there's a big part of this is it actually starts with the self, of actually making sure that as leaders, we're taking the time, not just to be good role models, but actually to look after ourselves and actually build an environment where we are able to be our best, able to actually be sustainable in ourselves.
And Alistair, that links into one of the questions we've just got in, which is how important is it for leaders to set a personal example?
Are critically important, and it's critically important because of the role modeling for the organization, but it's also critically important for their own enjoyment, their own satisfaction, their own delivery. And the thing is that this can be very hard as a senior leader with all of the pressures that work is not getting any easier. And we look at the world that we're seeing into 2023 and beyond. But it can also, we can take practical steps. And so one of the ones that I like sharing is the idea of an unpopular friend. And what I mean by that is that if you imagine that you are seeking to lose weight, if you've got a friend that actually calls out to you, hey, you said you're going to exercise today, have you got a chance to do that? Or you said you're going to eat differently. Not to shame you, but just to be that external voice, it can make a real difference. And the same can be true when it comes to your mental health and well-being. So is there someone that you trust who can actually call out and being able to say, hey, you don't seem like you're quite yourself today, or hey, let's commit to do whatever it is that drives your personal well-being. And if you're comfortable, share it with your organization. But whether you're comfortable or not, making sure that you're doing the doing about looking after yourself as a leader, I think critically important.
And Leah, perhaps the next question to you, although if others feel that they'd like to step in, that's obviously completely fine. One of the questions we've had is if we could elaborate on the difference between burnout and other related but different concepts like excessive working and respect for work-life balance. So welcome your initial thoughts, but welcome yours as well, Brad, and Alistair as well.
Yeah, I think I'm going to redirect it to Brad because he's looked more into burnout and the differences.
Yeah, sure. So I think when you think about those multiple concepts, they're obviously related. So if you are overworking, you are at higher risk for burnout because of, as I've mentioned before, with the definition of thinking about the job demands versus the job resources you have. You only have so much energy, attention, kind of ability to work to meet the demands that you're needing. So when you are being overworked, you're drawing down from your health reserves to then meet that increased demand from your job. So if you have that happen over time for a long time or for a period of time, that can then lead to things like burnout. Similarly, a poor work-life balance over time can also lead to those things because of that imbalance that is being continually pushed to draw down from your own health to support that gap in resources that you need to meet the demands of your job.
And Alistair, I'm going to come back to you now, given that you're the one who mentioned the jerks earlier on. So we've had a question, which is, what can we do about those jerks who actually might be good for profitability, but are bad for the culture and the people around them?
Yeah, they're always challenging, and I reflect. So in a previous life, I was a lawyer, and I came across a few of them. Not that there's more in law, but I just had in that life. And a few things seem to be true when you have the individuals behave like this. And I think it's important in how you respond to them. One, overwhelmingly, people show up to work to do a good job, what they think is a good job. But based on the pressures that we're under at work, outside work, and what behavior is rewarded over time, we develop a certain pattern of behavior. And a lot of the jerks that you'll see in a workplace are a product of that workplace or a prior workplace, with what's being rewarded, what's been acknowledged, or the patterns that they've developed to cope with it. So I think whatever's going on, you've got to start with some empathy, and you've got to start with a perspective, in a lot of cases, that you're giving somebody the chance to change. And so if you're starting with that perspective, where you've got to go then is be very clear on what your expectations are, very clear on what behaviorally your expectations are, and clear. Now that's a step that, like, most organizations get there. Most organizations will point you to the workplace behavior policy or code of conduct that they've got. And that's important, but it really doesn't go far enough. The next thing there is then following through. And following through can take all manner of things, but it becomes particularly important that senior leaders, when faced with an individual that's not meeting the behavioral bar, whether they're profitable or not, take action. Because the damage that you can do to a workplace culture by not taking action is far, far greater than the damage of the behavior. It's actually the multiplier of the leadership saying that this is okay is far more damaging than the behavior itself. And so that becomes the moment, truly the moment that matters. And one of the things to keep in mind for leaders that are out there and listening to this is the research shows globally, many, many times over, there is no jerk that is profitable enough that they actually offset the damage they do. in terms of what they're costing in terms of retention, attrition, underperformance, burnout, all the rest of it, they always in the long time cost more. So the argument that, well, actually, they are particularly important for our organization, it just doesn't hold water over the longer term. And if you can keep that in mind and come at it with empathy, then you've got a chance to actually take action. Now, the trickiest one is where the jerk is actually the senior leader, is because then it is, because I've spoken about it as if it's the senior leader seeing some of the behavior. And that's where the peers holding each other to account becomes really important. And being able to hold the mirror up and saying, hey, your conduct in this kind of setting, it just doesn't meet the bar, and giving them the chance to change as well.
Brad.
A couple of things to build on there. I think one way of framing toxic behaviors is thinking about it as a kind of incompetence. So if you would look at someone's job behavior, if they are meeting the bar or exceeding the bar in a number of places, but are showing this level of incompetence because they aren't able to run their team or whatever in a way that is not toxic, then that points towards kind of viewing that similarly to if they weren't able to manage their other KPIs well. So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is when you think about the impact, like Alistair mentioned, there's a contagion effect of toxic behavior, not only when you look at and say, oh, this person is very productive, you aren't seeing how their behavior is making others around them less productive because of the impact of their behaviors. And so I think one thing to think about with that is really just making sure that when you are evaluating the person, realizing that their own KPIs are not really measuring the whole picture, and that the impact is not only in the short term on their immediate team, but it's also coming back to the role modeling idea. People who are growing and like coming up through the organization are seeing that not only as something that is accepted, but this is how businesses get things done. And that's how you create a perpetual cycle where the people coming up, they've only ever experienced how to run a team in this type of environment. And so they would then run their own teams in that type of environment. So that's the other thing to think about. It's not only in the present day, the impact, but also kind of in your people development, it also has a negative impact there.
So I've got a couple more questions. So if people do want to post additional questions of their own, please do. But after those couple of questions, if there's no additional questions, we'll look to wrap up, conscious of the time. So Brad, if we stay with you, what are the implications for businesses who have rising burnout and mental health challenge rates?
Yeah, absolutely. So the rate of kind of mental health challenges, or I think specifically burnout, I can focus on with a couple of stats. What we found was that people who experienced symptoms of burnout were 6 times more likely to say that they intend to leave their organizations in the next 6 months. And they also showed that, reported that they had lower engagement, which we know is really related to kind of their productivity and effectiveness at work. So in having an environment that leads people to kind of these symptoms of burnout, it does impact the business itself, both in terms of the people, hiring, attraction, retention, but also the productivity and the quality of work getting done as well.
So my final question, and I'll leave this open, so please jump in, whoever wants to take it. How can we equip our senior leaders to be able to role model themselves, but also to spot toxic workplace behavior?
I'm happy to kick us off. I think one of the things, so there's a few different ways. One of the ways that I think we can equip our senior leaders is actually improving our measurement of what's going on in the workplace. And that doesn't mean that you're deploying some big all bells and whistles expensive survey suite. It's just acknowledging that annual engagement surveys are not going to give you the intel about this going on. It's just not frequent enough. It's not granular enough. So can you do some behavioral pulses or something that spots where this is going on, whatever you use, to increase the intelligence such that leaders know what's going on in the workplace. A second thing is making sure that they're also then getting the reflection of themselves back. A 360 survey is not a new thing, but just making sure that we are actually doing that and covering so leaders know their own shadow and their own behaviors, because that's going to get in the way of action. And then a third thing to start with is just making sure that the leaders have got the capability, have got the language to take action on this, being able to call out behavior in the right way, in the right moment, and follow through on action. It's a learned skill, and it's a learned skill that for many organizations, that even the most senior leaders it's not been something that tends to be rewarded over time. So making sure that we actually give the space to build that skill. So getting smarter on the intelligence that we can provide for them, making sure we're holding the mirror up for them and building the skills such that they can call it out. And then a final thing I'd share is also then making sure that we actually sheet the accountability home to them as well. So we're measuring it and it's actually something that matters. We talk about making it a strategic imperative. A strategic imperative only is the case if there's some sort of measurement that follows through and accountability that goes with that. So there'd be four things that I'd start with, but Leah, Brad, would love your builds.
Yeah, one other thing I would highlight. So I think one way to start seeing places and ways that they can be taking action is to take kind of the mental health or even the health more broadly of their workforce as a frame in decisions that aren't typically thought of as kind of related to mental health. So you can, and one way to think about this is it should not be siloed in the HR function. Like HR has a big role, but your operations or your sales, all of those things lead to the conditions, and the people within those spaces are impacted by the decisions that may not have been thought of as a health decision, but does lead to health impacts. And so I think expanding expanding the aperture a bit of what does it mean to create a healthy workplace, and making sure that you have that frame when you are thinking not only in HR decisions, but decisions more broadly.
Thanks, Brad. So thanks very much, everyone. And thanks in particular, Leah, Brad, and Alistair for your involvement today, and actually for all of Mckinsey's fantastic work. And I'd really commend the research to those of you who want to do a deeper dive. In terms of just some key points from today, I think one takeaway for me was just in relation to the importance, as always, with these types of wellbeing issues, of leadership and tone at the top, and of us as leaders, or those who are leaders on the call, role modeling those behaviors and actually taking care of themselves. I think it was really interesting to hear about the fact that a systemic response is required to achieve the most effect. We talked about the generational issues and the cultural issues. And for me, it's really interesting on the cultural side of things that there is a lot of commonality with respect to the key factors, but also some variance. And I therefore think if you're designing your program, you need to be alive to how those cultural variances might play out in your local market. We obviously heard about the toxic workplace culture, and we explored that in quite some detail. And we also talked about the issues and some of the practical ways in which businesses can start to deal with those things. But if I end where I began, which is in terms of this point around learning, with all these types of topics, there's a ripple effect. You throw a stone in and the ripples start to spread out. And I think starting to talk about issues like burnout, like we've discussed today, is really critical to getting those stones in the water so that we can start that ripple effect and start the conversation happening between all of us on this call and others. So if you do have any reflections or you've got any questions after today, please feel free to drop a line to Mind Forward Alliance or the CMHA if there's one in your jurisdiction. And as well as the McKinsey research itself, I'd also commend to you a publication which the CMHA in the UK put out, which is a practical guide in terms of how to prevent employee burnout. I'd like to thank all of you who joined at strange times, in particular around the world. Alistair's in Sydney, so it's very early in the morning for him. And with that, I'd like to end the call. So I hope you have a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good evening. Thank you.